During a late night at the office, a work-obsessed billionaire CEO gets a call from the local orphanage. "Hi sir, we have a little boy here who is convinced you're his father." Initially dismissing it as a mistake, he freezes in shock when he sees a picture of the child. Alexander Steele sat in his corner office, a monolithic expanse of glass overlooking the bustling city skyline. It was a testament to his success, a fortress he had built from the ground up, brick by brick, through sheer determination and an unyielding work ethic. Every inch of the space reflected his personality, sleek, efficient, and devoid of unnecessary sentimentality. His desk was impeccably organized, with papers stacked neatly and a single pen resting at a precise angle. Alexander thrived in order and control, two things he valued above all else. He leaned back in his leather chair, his sharp gray suit unwrinkled even after hours of meetings. His eyes flicked to the wall-mounted clock. 7:02 p.m. Another late night, not that it mattered. Work was his life. He had no family waiting for him, no obligations outside the empire he had built. To Alexander, emotions were distractions, ties that only served to weaken resolve. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. Alexander reached for it, expecting a routine update from one of his department heads or an analyst briefing him on quarterly figures. Instead, the caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. He frowned but answered, his tone clipped. "Steele." "Good evening, Mr. Steele," a warm, measured voice said on the other end. "My name is Marianne Carter. I'm the director of Haven's Heart Orphanage." Alexander's grip on the phone tightened. Charity requests were uncommon, though his assistant usually screened them. "If this is about a donation, my team handles those inquiries," he replied, already losing interest. "It's not about that, sir," Marianne said, her voice calm yet tinged with urgency. "I'm calling about a young boy named Jeremy. He's been staying with us for a few months now, and, well, he believes you're his father." The words hung in the air like an unexpected thunderclap. Alexander froze, his mind racing. "Excuse me?" he said, his tone sharpening. "I understand this may come as a shock," Marianne continued, unperturbed by his skepticism. "But Jeremy is convinced you're his father. He arrived here with very little, a few belongings and a photograph. We've tried to gently dissuade him, but he's insistent." "This is absurd," Alexander snapped, regaining his composure. "I don't have children, Ms. Carter. Whatever this boy believes, it's a mistake." There was a pause, then Marianne spoke again, softer this time. "I understand your skepticism, Mr. Steele, but I thought it was only fair to inform you. Jeremy's mother passed away recently, and he's been struggling to adjust. He clings to this belief as a source of hope." Alexander's jaw tightened. He didn't appreciate being drawn into personal dramas, especially those involving children. His past relationships had been fleeting, transactional. He'd never given anyone the chance to burden him with emotional complications. "Send me the photograph," he said curtly, intending to put the matter to rest. "I'll have someone look into it." "Of course. I'll email it to your office immediately," Marianne replied. "Thank you for taking the time to listen, Mr. Steele. I know this is unusual. I'll review it," he said tersely, ending the call without a goodbye. Alexander set the phone down and exhaled, irritation bubbling beneath his calm exterior. An orphan convinced he was the boy's father? It was preposterous. Still, a small part of him was curious. Who was this woman who claimed to have had his child? He pushed the thought aside and refocused on his laptop, burying himself in spreadsheets and projections. Work was the antidote to distraction, a salve for his ever-restless mind. Minutes later, his email chimed. A single message from Marianne Carter sat in his inbox, the subject line reading simply, "Jeremy." Attached was the photograph. Alexander clicked it open, his irritation giving way to something he couldn't quite name. The image was grainy, clearly taken on an old camera. It showed a small boy with unruly dark hair and bright, curious eyes. There was something about the way he tilted his head, the slight smirk on his lips, it was eerily familiar. For a moment, Alexander couldn't move. The resemblance was uncanny. It wasn't just the features but the expression, a mirror of his own childhood photos. His chest tightened, an unfamiliar sensation creeping into his otherwise controlled mind. Could it be possible? No, he told himself firmly. Coincidence. A trick of genetics. He closed the photo and pushed his chair back, standing abruptly. The pristine order of his office now felt suffocating. He grabbed his phone and called his assistant. "Get someone to investigate Haven's Heart Orphanage," he ordered. "I want a full background check on the boy and his mother. Names, dates, everything." "Yes, sir," came the efficient reply. Alexander ended the call and stared out the floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection faint against the city lights. He had always prided himself on being impenetrable, immune to the chaos of emotions that derailed so many others. But tonight, for the first time in years, he felt something stir. It was unsettling. And he didn't like it one bit. Alexander stood at the window of his office, the city lights below blurring as his mind wrestled with the image he'd just seen. He had spent years building his life to be untouchable, impermeable, but one grainy photograph was enough to make the walls of his certainty tremble. He tried to shake it off. It was ridiculous, wasn't it? There was no way this boy could be his. And yet, when he closed his eyes, that face, the smirk, the tilt of the head, seemed burned into his mind. A wave of unease washed over him, and for the first time in years, Alexander Steele felt genuinely unsettled. He paced back to his desk and sat down, the photograph still open on his laptop screen. His eyes traced every detail of the boy's face. The resemblance was undeniable, but resemblance wasn't proof. DNA tests could explain it, rationalize it, reduce it to science. That was how Alexander preferred things, logical, orderly, and indisputable. But then there were the memories. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his dark hair. The photograph stirred something buried deep, a time he had long since buried under layers of ambition and cold pragmatism. Her face emerged in his mind, unbidden yet vivid. Catherine. She was the kind of woman who left an impression, a whirlwind of laughter and passion that had caught him completely off guard. It had been years ago, a different lifetime, back when he wasn't yet the Alexander Steele whose name commanded boardrooms and headlines. He was just a man with ambition and a chip on his shoulder. Catherine had been an artist, fiery and fearless, with a way of seeing the world that both fascinated and infuriated him. Their connection had been instant, their relationship intense but ultimately fleeting. She wanted a life filled with creativity and connection. He wanted the world in the palm of his hand. They had parted abruptly, the breakup more like a collision. Catherine accused him of prioritizing his dreams over their relationship, of being emotionally unavailable. He, in turn, accused her of being impractical and unwilling to understand his drive. The last words they'd exchanged still echoed faintly in his mind. "One day, Alex, you'll realize success doesn't mean anything if there's no one to share it with." He had dismissed her words then, brushing them off as emotional rhetoric. But now, sitting in his sterile, meticulously curated office, they felt heavier than they ever had. Had Catherine known she was pregnant? Would she have kept that from him? He couldn't imagine her doing something so cruel, but their parting had been messy, full of anger and misunderstanding. He hadn't thought about her in years, but now, the photograph of Jeremy made him wonder if he had underestimated just how much had been left unsaid between them. Alexander snapped out of his thoughts as his assistant, Veronica, entered the room, placing a file on his desk. "Sir, here's the initial report on Haven's Heart Orphanage and the boy's background." He nodded, gesturing for her to leave as he opened the file. The information was sparse but sufficient to outline the basics. Jeremy was 7 years old, which lined up uncomfortably well with the timeline of his last days with Catherine. She had passed away a few months ago from a sudden illness, leaving behind no immediate family. The boy had been placed in the orphanage shortly after her death. Alexander's chest tightened. Catherine was gone. There would be no confrontation, no chance to ask her directly if Jeremy was his son. Instead, he was left with questions and a photograph that felt more like a ghost. He reached for his phone and called the investigator he had hired earlier. "I need more," he said tersely. "Find out everything you can about Catherine Hartley's life over the past 7 years. And look into the boy's records. I want to know if there's anything at all, that definitively connects him to me." "Yes, sir," came the efficient response. Alexander ended the call and leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. He hated this feeling, this loss of control, this nagging doubt. He was a man who thrived on certainty, yet here he was, grappling with something as intangible as a hunch. Later that night, in the solitude of his penthouse apartment, the photograph haunted him again. He had opened his laptop to finish some work, but instead, he found himself staring at Jeremy's face once more. His mind filled in gaps, overlaying the boy's features with his own childhood memories. He had been a quiet, serious child, too, his expressions often unreadable to those around him. As he stared at the photograph, flashes of Catherine came back to him in sharp bursts. The way she'd laugh at his stubbornness, the way she'd sketch him while he worked, claiming she loved the way his brow furrowed when he was deep in thought. He remembered the arguments, too, how she'd call him a robot when he refused to show vulnerability, how he'd scoff at her idealism. And then, one memory surfaced that stopped him cold. It had been one of their final nights together, after an argument about his refusal to take a weekend off. Catherine had been unusually quiet, her hands resting on her stomach as they sat in the dim light of her studio. "You'll regret this someday, Alex," she had said, her voice softer than usual. He had brushed her off, assuming it was just another emotional plea for him to slow down. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, her words took on a different weight. Had she known then? Had she been trying to tell him something? Alexander closed his laptop, unable to shake the feeling that he had overlooked something monumental. If Jeremy was his son, and that was still an if, what did that mean for him? For his life? He had spent decades perfecting his solitude, insulating himself from distractions and attachments. Could he be a father to this boy? Did he even want to be? As the city hummed quietly outside his window, Alexander knew one thing for certain: he couldn't ignore this. Whether it was guilt, curiosity, or something deeper, he was drawn to the photograph and the boy it captured. For the first time in years, Alexander Steele felt the cracks in his perfectly constructed world, and he wasn't sure if he had the strength, or the desire, to seal them shut. The photograph lingered in Alexander's mind, a constant presence that refused to fade no matter how much he buried himself in work. His investigation had yielded some answers but also more questions. Catherine had left behind no close friends or family who could shed light on her final years. Her illness had come swiftly, and her death left Jeremy in the care of an overburdened system. Yet the boy's unwavering belief, his conviction that Alexander was his father, gnawed at him. The image of Jeremy's face haunted him in the quiet moments, a reminder of something unresolved. Alexander had always prided himself on being decisive, but for the first time in years, he hesitated. Logic dictated that he distance himself, but something deeper, something uncomfortable, compelled him to act. Late one afternoon, Alexander found himself driving toward Haven's Heart Orphanage. The sleek black car felt foreign to him, its luxurious leather seats and subdued hum failing to provide their usual comfort. He hadn't announced his visit. He didn't want the fanfare or the forced gratitude he often received when stepping into charity events. This wasn't about appearances. It was personal, even if he refused to admit it aloud. The orphanage was tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, a modest brick building surrounded by a small garden. It was a stark contrast to the gleaming skyscrapers Alexander was accustomed to. As he stepped out of his car, he straightened his jacket, his expression as impenetrable as ever. Inside, a receptionist greeted him, her surprise evident but quickly masked by professionalism. "Mr. Steele, we weren't expecting you," she said. "I'm here to speak with Marianne Carter," he replied, his voice even. The receptionist nodded and led him down a narrow hallway to a warmly lit office. Marianne stood as he entered, her demeanor calm but curious. "Mr. Steele," she said, extending a hand. "I didn't expect you to visit in person." Alexander shook her hand briefly, then gestured toward the chair opposite her desk. Let's get to the point. I want to meet the boy. Marianne's gaze softened, but she didn't comment on his bluntness. Instead, she stood and motioned for him to follow. They walked through the orphanage's hallways, past classrooms filled with laughter and the faint hum of activity. The building was old but well kept, and the children's artwork adorned the walls, bringing a touch of brightness to the otherwise utilitarian space. Marianne paused outside a door. Jeremy's in here, she said softly. Before you go in, I should tell you, he's been through a lot. Losing his mother was hard enough, but he's also faced rejection from other potential guardians. He's resilient, but he's still a child. Alexander nodded curtly, his face unreadable. Marianne opened the door, and he stepped inside. Jeremy sat on the floor, surrounded by Legos. He looked up when Alexander entered, his dark eyes wide with curiosity. For a moment neither spoke. Alexander studied the boy, noting the way his hair fell in messy curls, the slight tilt of his head as he observed the stranger before him. You're him, Jeremy said suddenly, his voice filled with certainty. Alexander blinked, caught off guard by the boy's confidence. What makes you so sure? Jeremy grinned and held up a small, worn photograph. It was the same one Alexander had seen, likely the only tangible connection Jeremy had to his past. Mom said you were important, Jeremy said. She showed me this and said you'd come one day. Alexander felt a lump rise in his throat, though he quickly swallowed it down. He crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to Jeremy's level. I'm sorry about your mother, he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Jeremy nodded solemnly. She was really nice. She used to say I looked like you. The boy's openness caught Alexander off guard. He had expected shyness, maybe even fear. Instead, he was met with warmth, an unshakable belief that their lives were meant to intersect. It was disarming. Marianne stepped forward, breaking the silence. Jeremy's mother, Catherine, left us very little information about his father. She passed away shortly after arriving here, but she insisted on writing down one name, Alexander Steele. Alexander's breath hitched, though his expression remained neutral. He glanced at Marianne. That's all she left behind? A name? She didn't explain, Marianne replied, her voice gentle. But she seemed certain. She told us it was enough. Enough. The word echoed in Alexander's mind. Catherine had trusted that one name to carry the weight of her son's future. But why? Why hadn't she reached out to him directly? He turned his attention back to Jeremy, who was still watching him with an unwavering gaze. Do you really think I'm your father? Alexander asked, his voice firmer now. Jeremy nodded without hesitation. You look like me. And I just feel it. The simplicity of the boy's statement struck Alexander. There was no agenda, no ulterior motive. Just a belief rooted in something intangible. Jeremy, Marianne interjected, her tone kind. Why don't you show Mr. Steele your drawings while I speak with him for a moment? The boy nodded eagerly and ran to retrieve a stack of papers. Marianne guided Alexander out into the hallway, closing the door behind them. I know this is overwhelming, she said. But Jeremy truly believes what he's saying. Whether it's true or not, he's been through a lot. He needs stability, someone who can help him feel safe. Alexander crossed his arms, his jaw tight. You're asking me to take responsibility for a child I might not even be connected to. I'm asking you to consider the possibility, Marianne replied. If there's even a chance he's your son, don't you think he deserves to know you? Alexander didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked back through the small window on the door. Jeremy was kneeling on the floor, carefully arranging his drawings in a neat pile. The boy's face was lit with determination, and for a brief moment, Alexander saw a flicker of himself in that intensity. Marianne's voice softened. Whatever you decide, Mr. Steele, Jeremy needs someone who believes in him. And maybe you need someone to believe in you, too. The words hit him harder than he expected. Without another word, He nodded curtly and stepped back into the room. Jeremy looked up, his face breaking into a wide grin. "Did you see my drawings?" the boy asked, holding one up proudly. Alexander crouched again, taking the paper in his hands. It was a simple sketch of two stick figures holding hands, a towering skyscraper in the background. Written in unsteady letters at the top were the words "Me and Dad." Alexander's chest tightened as he stared at the drawing. For the first time, he wondered if the boy's belief might not be misplaced after all. Alexander couldn't shake the boy's face from his mind. As he returned to his penthouse, the city lights below blurred into an indistinct haze, their usual brilliance muted by the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. Jeremy's unwavering belief, his innocent certainty, it was as though the boy had cracked something inside him, something Alexander had spent years fortifying. He poured himself a glass of whiskey as soon as he stepped inside, the amber liquid catching the glow of the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The photograph of Jeremy sat on the sleek coffee table where he had left it the night before, but now it seemed louder, more intrusive, demanding his attention. He picked it up again, studying the boy's bright eyes and mischievous grin. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Alexander's mind drifted to Catherine, as it had so often since that day at the orphanage. The memory of her was vivid now, her fiery spirit and the way she had challenged him at every turn. Catherine had always seen life through a lens of emotion and connection, the very things he had dismissed as distractions. She used to call him a man of stone, accusing him of sealing himself away from the world. He'd scoffed at the time, certain she simply didn't understand his drive. But as he stared at the photograph of Jeremy, he wondered if Catherine had been right all along. If the boy truly was his son, what had she felt in those final moments? Had she struggled with whether or not to tell him? Had she hoped he would figure it out on his own? The questions were maddening, and they only grew louder the longer he sat there. Unable to endure the uncertainty, Alexander picked up his phone and dialed his assistant. "Veronica," he said, his voice sharper than usual. "I need a DNA test arranged immediately." There was a brief pause, then her efficient reply. "Of course, sir. Should I coordinate with the orphanage?" "Yes. Make it discreet. I don't want this leaked." "Understood," Veronica said before hanging up. Alexander set the phone down and exhaled, the sound more like a sigh of frustration than relief. The test would give him clarity, something tangible to ground his thoughts. Yet, as he sat back and stared at the photograph, he realized the answer scared him more than he cared to admit. What would he do if the boy was his son? Alexander had spent his life building walls, insulating himself from vulnerability. Parenting wasn't in his nature, it wasn't even in his vocabulary. And yet, there was a small part of him, a sliver, that wondered if it was something he could do, if it was something he should do. The days that followed were agonizing. Work, which had always been his sanctuary, became a source of frustration. He found himself distracted during meetings, his mind wandering back to the boy at the orphanage. The numbers on spreadsheets blurred, and even the sharp exchanges of high-stakes negotiations failed to hold his attention. His employees began to notice, though none dared to mention it. At night, the silence of his penthouse was unbearable. The photograph of Jeremy remained on his desk, a constant reminder of the uncertainty that loomed over him. Alexander found himself replaying conversations with Catherine, searching for any clue he might have missed. There were flashes, moments he had dismissed at the time but now carried new weight. One memory in particular stood out. It had been a late night in her studio, the smell of paint lingering in the air. Catherine had been quieter than usual, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. "You'll regret this someday, Alex," she had said, her voice softer than usual. He had brushed her off, assuming it was just another of her dramatic proclamations. But now, the memory felt heavier, more deliberate. Had she tried to tell him? And if she had, what would he have done? Would he have listened? Alexander shook his head, frustrated by the circular nature of his thoughts. The DNA test would answer everything. Until then, he was trapped in limbo, caught between the life he had meticulously built and the one he might have unknowingly ignored. One evening, as the sun set over the city, bathing his penthouse in a golden glow, Alexander found himself staring at the stick figure drawing Jeremy had shown him. It had been tucked inside the folder Marianne had given him, a simple depiction of two figures labeled me and Dad. The boy's belief was unwavering, and Alexander couldn't decide if that made the situation better or worse. Jeremy didn't just want a father, he wanted him. That thought, more than anything else, unsettled Alexander the most. He had spent his entire life running from emotional entanglements, and now, he was being confronted with the very thing he had worked so hard to avoid. And yet, as much as he resisted, a part of him couldn't help but wonder. Was it possible that he could be the person Jeremy believed him to be? That he could, in some way, be enough? The days stretched on, each one longer than the last. Alexander buried himself in work, but the boy's face was always there, in the back of his mind, refusing to be ignored. When the orphanage finally called to say the test had been completed, his heart skipped a beat. But the results weren't ready yet. They would need more time to finalize the analysis and confirm everything. The delay, though brief, felt unbearable. For a man used to control and immediate results, the wait was excruciating. As he hung up the phone, Alexander stared out the window, his reflection faint against the city skyline. He had always prided himself on being decisive, on never second-guessing his actions. But now, for the first time in years, he felt paralyzed. Whether Jeremy was his son or not, the boy had already changed something within him. And that realization was almost as terrifying as the unknown answer that awaited him. The days stretched into a week, and the wait for the DNA test results began to feel interminable. Alexander wasn't accustomed to uncertainty. In his world, problems were solved through decisive action, but now he was left in limbo, his life hovering between what it had been and what it might soon become. Rather than retreat further into his work, a reliable coping mechanism for years, Alexander found himself returning to Haven's heart. He wasn't entirely sure why he kept going back. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was the photograph still sitting on his desk, refusing to let him move on. Either way, he couldn't deny the pull. When he arrived at the orphanage, Jeremy greeted him with the kind of unrestrained joy that caught Alexander off guard. The boy ran up to him, a wide grin spreading across his face, and grabbed his hand without hesitation. "You came back!" Jeremy exclaimed, his excitement palpable. Alexander hesitated, and used to such open affection, but something about the boy's enthusiasm was contagious. He nodded. "I said I would." Marianne, watching from a distance, gave him a knowing smile but said nothing. She simply gestured for Jeremy to lead Alexander away, and the boy didn't waste a moment, pulling him toward a small playroom filled with toys, books, and a few other children. Jeremy talked incessantly, his words tumbling out in an endless stream. He showed Alexander his favorite toys, his latest drawings, and a small collection of treasures he had gathered, a shiny rock, a button, and a worn-out key he had found in the garden. Each item came with an elaborate story, and Alexander couldn't help but be amused by the boy's imagination. "You see this?" Jeremy held up the key, his eyes wide. "I think it's for a treasure chest. Maybe there's gold or something." Alexander raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. "And where's the treasure chest?" "I haven't found it yet," Jeremy admitted undeterred. "But I will. You just wait." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying the boy. Jeremy's boundless optimism and resourcefulness were oddly familiar, stirring something deep within him. The boy reminded him of himself at that age, searching for meaning and excitement in the smallest things. He had been a dreamer once, though life had quickly tempered that with harsh realities. Jeremy, however, was unbroken by the challenges he'd faced. His resilience was evident in the way he spoke, the way he carried himself. Despite everything, he still believed in treasure chests and happy endings. As the afternoon wore on, Alexander found himself relaxing in Jeremy's presence. The boy was a natural storyteller, weaving tales out of thin air, and Alexander found himself listening more than speaking, a rare occurrence for a man accustomed to commanding every room he entered. At one point, Jeremy looked up at him, his expression suddenly serious. "Do you think my mom would be proud of me?" he asked, his voice quieter. The question caught Alexander off guard. He hesitated, unsure how to answer, but then he saw the vulnerability in the boy's eyes and realized how much the answer mattered. "Yes," Alexander said firmly. "I think she'd be very proud." Jeremy's face lit up, and Alexander felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the boy's joy that moved him, it was the realization that he wanted to be someone Jeremy could look up to, someone who could answer questions like that with certainty. Over the next few visits, their bond deepened. Alexander began to look forward to their time together, something he never thought possible. Jeremy showed him how to play an absurdly complicated board game, patiently explaining the rules as Alexander fumbled through his turns. They worked on a jigsaw puzzle together, and while Jeremy had the focus of a laser beam, Alexander found himself surprisingly invested in finishing it too. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden behind the orphanage, Jeremy climbed onto the bench beside him and pulled out a small notebook. He opened it to a blank page and handed it to Alexander along with a pencil. "Draw something," Jeremy urged, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "I'm not much of an artist," Alexander replied, though he took the pencil anyway. "Doesn't matter. Just draw what you feel." The words were so reminiscent of Catherine that Alexander froze for a moment. She had said the same thing to him once, years ago, while coaxing him to sit for her sketchbook. With a deep breath, he began to draw, his strokes hesitant and unsure. Jeremy watched intently, offering enthusiastic encouragement with every line. When Alexander finished, the result was a crude but recognizable sketch of a tree. Jeremy clapped as though it were a masterpiece. "See? You're good at this," the boy declared, beaming. Alexander chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're easily impressed." Jeremy leaned closer, examining the sketch. "You know, I think you'll like this tree," he said, his tone thoughtful. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "Well, it's big and strong, but it looks like it's been through some storms," Jeremy explained. "But it's still standing." The simplicity of Jeremy's observation hit Alexander harder than he expected. The boy's words, innocent yet profound, resonated in a way that left him momentarily speechless. He had spent so long building an image of strength, of invincibility, but here was a child who saw through it all without even trying. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the garden, Alexander found himself wondering how much of his life he had sacrificed chasing something that suddenly felt hollow. Jeremy's resilience, his boundless curiosity, and his ability to find joy in the smallest moments made Alexander question everything he thought he valued. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something stir in the depths of his guarded heart. It wasn't just affection for Jeremy, it was a longing to be better, to be someone worthy of the boy's admiration. And for Alexander Steele, that was a terrifying yet oddly exhilarating realization. The DNA test still loomed, a question mark that could change everything. But as he watched Jeremy play in the fading light, Alexander realized that, regardless of the result, he was already beginning to care for the boy in ways he hadn't anticipated. Jeremy had started to crack the armor Alexander had spent a lifetime perfecting, and he wasn't sure he wanted to rebuild it. Alexander arrived at Haven's Heart earlier than usual, his demeanor carefully composed, though the turmoil inside him was harder to mask. He had spent the past few days growing closer to Jeremy, finding himself drawn to the boy's warmth and unshakable optimism. Yet, the unanswered question still loomed, casting a shadow over every moment they shared. When Marian greeted him in the office that morning, she carried an envelope in her hand, her expression soft yet serious. "These came in," she said simply, placing the envelope on the desk between them. Alexander stared at it, the weight of what it represented pressing down on him. He had spent years making decisions that shaped industries, yet he hesitated now, his hand hovering over something so deceptively small. Finally, he picked it up, the paper crinkling slightly under his grip. Marianne didn't speak, giving him the space to process. Slowly, he opened the envelope, his movements uncharacteristically cautious. Inside was a single sheet of paper, clinical in its presentation. The words were simple and direct, leaving no room for ambiguity. The test confirmed it. Jeremy was his son. For a moment, Alexander felt the world tilt beneath him. He sat down heavily, the letters still clutched in his hand. He had prepared himself for this possibility, or so he thought, but the reality hit harder than expected. The boy he had grown fond of, the boy who reminded him so much of himself, was undeniably his. Marianne's voice broke through the silence, gentle but firm. I know this is a lot to take in. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. Alexander let out a short, humorless laugh. Overwhelmed doesn't even begin to cover it. Marianne sat across from him, her expression kind. Jeremy deserves to know the truth, but he also needs someone who's ready to be there for him. I've seen the way he looks at you, Alexander. He already sees you as his father. The words landed heavily, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. For years, Alexander had avoided attachments, convinced they would only complicate his carefully structured life. Now, he was faced with something he couldn't ignore, something that demanded more from him than he had ever given anyone. I don't even know how to be a father, he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. I didn't have one growing up. How am I supposed to do this? Marianne studied him for a moment before speaking. You start by showing up. That's all Jeremy really wants, for you to be there. Before he could respond, Marianne reached into her desk drawer and pulled out another envelope. This one was older, the edges slightly worn. She slid it across the desk toward him. This was among Catherine's belongings, she said. I think it's time you read it. Alexander hesitated before picking it up. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Catherine's, and for a moment, he felt the sharp sting of her absence all over again. Taking a deep breath, he unfolded the letter and began to read. Alex, if you're reading this, it means you've met our son. Yes, he's yours. I never doubted it for a moment. I didn't tell you because I knew what your life was like, the demands of your world. I didn't want Jeremy to feel like an obligation or a burden. I wanted him to grow up surrounded by love, even if that meant I had to do it on my own. But as I write this, I know I may not have much time left. And if I can't be there for him, I need him to know you. Not the version of you that scared me away, but the man I fell in love with, the one who saw the world with sharp eyes and endless determination. The one who, deep down, had a heart, even if he didn't always show it. Jeremy is the best thing I've ever done, Alex. He's smart, kind, and so full of life. He has your stubbornness and your wit, and sometimes, when he looks at me, I see you so clearly it hurts. I hope, if you've met him, you'll see it too. Take care of him, Alex. Teach him to dream big, but remind him that love is what gives those dreams meaning. I hope you'll find a way to be the father he deserves. And maybe, in doing so, you'll find the part of yourself you've been missing all these years. Catherine, the letter slipped from Alexander's hands, landing softly on the desk. He leaned back, his mind reeling from her words. Catherine had known him better than he had realized, even in their brief time together. She had seen through his walls, his defenses, and still believed there was more to him than what he let the world see. Marianne's voice brought him back to the present. She loved you, Alexander. And she trusted you, even if she didn't show it the way you expected. Alexander nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. The guilt was almost suffocating. He had been so focused on his ambitions, so determined to shut out distractions, that he had missed something monumental. But now, the truth was staring him in the face, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. I need to tell him, he said finally, his voice steadier now. Marianne smiled softly. He's in the garden. Alexander stood, tucking the letter carefully into his pocket. As he walked through the orphanage, his mind raced with what he would say. By the time he stepped into the garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the space, he spotted Jeremy playing by the flower beds. The boy looked up and grinned when he saw Alexander. You're back! Alexander took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet Jeremy's gaze. I am. And there's something I need to tell you. Jeremy tilted his head, his expression curious but not fearful. What is it? Alexander knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's level. The test. It came back. And it confirmed what you've been saying all along. Jeremy's eyes widened. You mean? You're really my dad? Yes, Alexander said, his voice soft but firm. I'm your dad. For a moment, Jeremy was silent, as though trying to process the words. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he threw his arms around Alexander's neck, holding on tightly. Alexander froze, unaccustomed to such affection, but then he felt his arms move almost on their own, wrapping around the boy in return. I knew it, Jeremy whispered, his voice muffled against Alexander's shoulder. I just knew it. As they stayed there, the weight of Catherine's words settled in Alexander's mind. He had been given a second chance, not just to be a father but to rediscover the parts of himself he had buried long ago. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Alexander wasn't sure what to expect when he brought Jeremy into his life. The decision had been made quickly after the DNA results, but the reality of it didn't fully sink in until the boy stood in the grand entryway of Alexander's penthouse, wide-eyed and clutching a small bag of belongings. This is where you live? Jeremy asked, craning his neck to take in the high ceilings and sprawling city view. Alexander nodded, suddenly feeling self-conscious about the cold, minimalist design. It was the kind of place that screamed efficiency, not warmth. He realized, not for the first time, how much of his life was tailored to his own needs that rarely extended beyond work. We'll make it more comfortable, he said awkwardly, unsure what that even meant. Jeremy didn't seem bothered. He explored the space with the enthusiasm only a child could muster, running from room to room and marveling at the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Alexander watched him, a strange mix of pride and anxiety settling in his chest. This was his son. His son. The concept still felt foreign, and he wondered how long it would take to feel natural, or if it ever would. The first few weeks were a whirlwind. Alexander had assumed he could balance his life the way he always had, compartmentalizing his responsibilities and maintaining control. But Jeremy didn't fit into neat compartments. He was a 7-year-old boy with boundless energy, endless questions, and a knack for showing up at the worst possible moments. On more than one occasion, Alexander found himself in the middle of a high-stakes video conference when Jeremy would burst into the room, waving a drawing or asking for help with homework. His colleagues, who were used to his no-nonsense demeanor, were visibly startled by the interruptions. Is that a child? One executive asked during a particularly tense meeting. Yes, Alexander replied curtly, muting his microphone as he motioned for Jeremy to wait. It didn't take long for word to spread through his company, and then, inevitably, to the media. The headlines were relentless. Alexander Steele, workaholic CEO, takes on fatherhood, and the billionaire and his secret son. Journalists speculated on how this newfound role would impact his empire, while critics questioned his ability to manage both his company and a child. Alexander tried to ignore the noise, but it was impossible to escape. Even his board members expressed concern, their thinly veiled criticisms surfacing in meetings. Your focus seems divided lately, one of them said delicately. My focus is exactly where it needs to be, Alexander replied firmly, though he knew they didn't believe him. Despite the challenges, there were moments that made it all worth it. Jeremy's laughter filled the once silent penthouse, and Alexander found himself smiling more than he had in years. They played board games at the dining table, watched movies on the oversized couch, and shared meals that Alexander's chef adapted to include Jeremy's favorite foods. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Jeremy struggled to adjust to his new life, too. He missed the familiarity of the orphanage, the friends he had left behind, and the routine he had grown used to. He also tested Alexander's patience, as children often do, pushing boundaries and questioning rules. You work too much, Jeremy said one evening, his voice matter-of-fact as he watched Alexander type furiously on his laptop. I have responsibilities, Alexander replied, not looking up. So do I, Jeremy shot back. Like building my Lego city. But I don't do it all the time. Alexander paused, the boy's words hitting him harder than they should have. He closed the laptop and turned to face Jeremy. You're right, he admitted. I'll finish this later. It was a small moment, but one that stuck with him. Jeremy had a way of cutting through Alexander's defenses, forcing him to confront the parts of himself he had long ignored. It wasn't just about being a father, it was about being present, about learning to value time in a way he never had before. The transition wasn't just personal. Alexander began to make changes at work, delegating more responsibilities to his senior team and stepping back from the day-to-day grind. It wasn't an easy shift. He had spent years building his empire, and the idea of relinquishing even a fraction of control was deeply uncomfortable. But every time he second-guessed himself, he thought of Jeremy and the promise he had made to be there, to show up. The media continued to speculate, their scrutiny intensifying as Alexander's priorities shifted. But he found himself caring less about their opinions. His focus was on Jeremy, who needed him in ways that no one else ever had. One evening, after dinner, Jeremy climbed onto the couch beside him, holding a book he had picked out earlier that day. Can you read this with me? He asked, his voice small but hopeful. Alexander hesitated. He had emails to respond to and a stack of reports waiting for him. But then he looked at Jeremy, at the way the boy's eyes sparkled with anticipation, and he realized those things could wait. Of course, he said, taking the book and settling in beside him. They spent the next hour reading together, Jeremy's head resting against Alexander's arm. It was a simple moment, but as Alexander turned the pages, he felt something shift within him. For so long, he had defined himself by his achievements, by the deals he closed, and the accolades he earned. But sitting there with his son, he realized there was a different kind of success, one that couldn't be measured in numbers or headlines. By the time Jeremy fell asleep, his small frame curled up against Alexander, the CEO felt a sense of peace he hadn't known he was missing. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges and adjustments, but for the first time in years, Alexander felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As he carried Jeremy to bed, tucking him in with the care he was still learning to perfect, he thought of Catherine's letter and the faith she had placed in him. He wasn't sure he was the man she had described, but he was willing to try. For Jeremy, he would keep showing up, one day at a time. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, Alexander began to settle into his new role. Fatherhood, once an unthinkable disruption to his carefully structured life, had become a source of unexpected fulfillment. Jeremy's presence brought color and vitality to Alexander's world, transforming his sterile penthouse into a place filled with laughter, cluttered toys, and the occasional fort made of couch cushions. Alexander found himself rearranging his priorities in ways that once seemed impossible. His mornings now started with breakfast at the table with Jeremy, a routine that often involved burnt toast and cereal spills, but also the kind of joy Alexander hadn't known he was missing. Work no longer consumed him the way it once had. He delegated more, carving out time to take Jeremy to school, attend his soccer games, and help with homework in the evenings. Their bond deepened with every passing day. Alexander learned that Jeremy had a sharp mind and an even sharper wit, traits that often left him both amused and astounded. Jeremy, in turn, thrived under Alexander's attention, his confidence growing as he realized he was truly wanted. One Saturday afternoon, they decided to visit a science museum. Alexander, ever the planner, had purchased tickets in advance and mapped out the exhibits, but Jeremy had other ideas. He dragged Alexander to the dinosaur hall first, then insisted on touching every interactive display in the physics wing. By the end of the visit, Alexander's meticulous schedule was in shambles, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Jeremy's wide-eyed wonder at every new discovery made the chaos worth it. "Did you know that some dinosaurs had feathers?" Jeremy asked as they left the museum, clutching a toy pterosaur from the gift shop. "I didn't," Alexander admitted, smiling down at him. You'll have to teach me more about them. Jeremy grinned. I will. Maybe we can go back next weekend. Alexander ruffled Jeremy's hair, the simple gesture now feeling natural. It's a deal. The changes in Alexander's life extended beyond his relationship with Jeremy. Inspired by his time at Haven's Heart and by Catherine's enduring legacy, he decided to make a lasting impact. He donated a significant portion of his wealth to the orphanage, ensuring it could expand its facilities and provide better resources for the children it served. But he didn't stop there. In Catherine's name, he launched the Hartley Foundation, dedicated to supporting single parents and children in need. The foundation's mission was simple yet profound: to give others the kind of second chance Alexander had been given. It was a way of honoring Catherine, of ensuring her kindness and vision lived on. At the foundation's launch event, held in the newly renovated orphanage garden, Alexander stood beside Jeremy as he addressed the small crowd. His speech was brief but heartfelt, a stark contrast to the polished presentations he was known for in the corporate world. This isn't just about giving back, he said, his hand resting gently on Jeremy's shoulder. It's about building something meaningful, for the people who matter most. Catherine taught me the importance of that, and Jeremy reminded me of it. The applause that followed was genuine, but it was Jeremy's whispered, "You did great, Dad." That truly stayed with Alexander. Life wasn't perfect, of course. There were still moments of doubt, and days when the weight of balancing work and fatherhood felt overwhelming. But Alexander no longer saw those challenges as obstacles. Instead, he embraced them as part of the life he was building, a life that finally felt whole. One crisp autumn morning, Alexander and Jeremy decided to visit the park near their home. The air was cool but not cold, and the leaves crunched under their feet as they walked. Jeremy held Alexander's hand, swinging it back and forth as they followed the winding path through the trees. "Hey, Dad," Jeremy said suddenly, looking up at him. "Yes? I'm glad you're my dad," Jeremy said, his voice filled with quiet sincerity. Alexander stopped walking and knelt down so he was eye level with Jeremy. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his own voice steady but thick with emotion. "And I'm glad you're my son." For a moment they stayed like that, the world around them fading into the background. Then Jeremy grinned, the mischievous sparkle Alexander had come to adore lighting up his face. "Race you to the playground," Jeremy shouted, breaking into a run. Alexander laughed, shaking his head before taking off after him. As he chased Jeremy through the park, the sound of their laughter blending with the rustling leaves, Alexander realized that this was what he had been missing all along, not the accolades, not the deals, but the simple, irreplaceable joy of connection. And in that moment, as Jeremy's laughter filled the air, Alexander knew he had finally found the meaning Catherine had always spoken of. Together, he and Jeremy were building a future rooted in love, one step, and one laugh, at a time. The bond between Alexander and Jeremy deepened as their days together turned into months. Their routine, once a patchwork of new experiences and adjustments, now felt natural. Alexander had learned not only to embrace fatherhood but to cherish it. But as their life settled into a rhythm, Alexander found himself thinking about what came next, not just for them, but for others who needed the same chance at connection and belonging. One evening, after tucking Jeremy into bed, Alexander sat at his desk, looking over the latest updates from the Hartley Foundation. The orphanage renovations were nearly complete, and the foundation had already helped dozens of single parents with financial aid and counseling services. Yet, it didn't feel like enough. He leaned back in his chair, Catherine's letter resting on the desk beside him. Her words had become a guidepost, shaping how he approached his new life and responsibilities. But there was one line that stood out to him now: teach him to dream big, but remind him that love is what gives those dreams meaning. Alexander realized it was time to teach Jeremy not just through words but through action. The next morning, he brought Jeremy to the orphanage with him, a surprise he had planned for days. Jeremy was excited as always, his curiosity bubbling over as they entered the newly renovated building. but his expression turned serious when Alexander introduced him to a group of children who were still waiting for families of their own. "These kids are so cool," Jeremy whispered to Alexander after a few minutes of playing. "But why don't they have a home yet?" Alexander crouched down, meeting Jeremy's gaze. "Sometimes it takes a little longer to find the right family," he said gently. "But that's why we're here, to help make sure they have everything they need until they do." Jeremy frowned thoughtfully before nodding. "Can we come back and visit them again?" "We can do more than that," Alexander said. "I was thinking we could work together to make sure they have even more. Like books, toys, and maybe some special trips." Jeremy's face lit up. "Like a team?" Alexander smiled. "Exactly like a team." Over the next few weeks, Alexander and Jeremy worked together to create a new program through the Hartley Foundation, Dreams in Action. The initiative was designed to give children in the orphanage access to opportunities they might not otherwise have, from creative workshops to mentorship programs. Jeremy took his role seriously, drawing up ideas on brightly colored paper and sharing them with Alexander every night. "This one's for an art day," Jeremy explained one evening, holding up a picture of kids painting. "And this one's for a science trip." Alexander marveled at Jeremy's enthusiasm, seeing in his son the same drive that had fueled his own success, only this time, it was fueled by pure-hearted generosity. The first Dreams in Action event was a huge success. The children at the orphanage spent the day painting murals, crafting collages, and sharing their creations with each other. Jeremy was at the center of it all, running from group to group, encouraging everyone with his boundless energy. At the end of the day, as the sun set and the last of the paintbrushes were put away, Jeremy stood next to Alexander, looking out at the murals they had created together. "Do you think Mom would like this?" Jeremy asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the colorful wall. Alexander placed a hand on his shoulder. "I think she'd love it. And I think she'd be proud of you." Jeremy smiled, leaning into his father's side. "I'm proud of us." As they left the orphanage that evening, Alexander felt a profound sense of peace. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, but it was moments like this, seeing Jeremy's joy, hearing his laughter, and knowing they were making a difference, that made him feel truly fulfilled. The Hartley Foundation continued to grow, and so did Alexander and Jeremy's vision for it. Together, they began to visit other communities, sharing their story and encouraging others to get involved. Jeremy became the Foundation's unofficial ambassador, his enthusiasm and charm winning over everyone he met. For Alexander, it wasn't just about leaving a legacy anymore. It was about creating a future that reflected the love and connection he had found with Jeremy. And as they walked hand in hand through each new adventure, Alexander knew that their story was only just beginning. Alexander Steele's journey from a work-obsessed billionaire to a devoted father is proof that life can change in the most unexpected ways. Through Jeremy, he found not only a family but also a purpose far greater than himself. Their story is one of resilience, love, and the power of second chances, reminding us that sometimes, the most valuable things aren't measured by wealth or success but by the connections we build and the lives we touch. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales like this one. Let us know in the comments what part of Alexander and Jeremy's journey resonated with you the most. And remember, even small acts of kindness can make a world of difference. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.